July 15th, 2026. On a mountain road near Piranshahr, in a province the Islamic Republic of Iran has spent 50 years insisting it fully controls, something happened that Tehran did not want the world to see, did not want documented, and has been working to frame as routine counterterrorism ever since. Revolutionary Guard soldiers died in a sustained firefight with Kurdish Peshmerga fighters operating deep inside Iranian territory. Not at the border, not in a brief exchange of fire at a checkpoint. A direct, sustained engagement inside Iran's own claimed sovereign ground, in a region the regime has always treated as its private problem to handle, in silence, away from international mediators, away from press conferences, away from any outside scrutiny that might force it to acknowledge what is actually happening along its western frontier. The message sent by that firefight was not subtle. It was not symbolic. It was written in the blood of Revolutionary Guard soldiers on a mountain road, and it reached Tehran with a clarity that no diplomatic communication, no intelligence assessment, and no aerial surveillance photograph could have delivered with the same psychological weight. And that is what terrifies the Islamic Republic about what is happening in the Zagros Mountains right now, far more than another round of American airstrikes on its coastal infrastructure. Airstrikes come from outside. They can be framed as foreign aggression, used to rally domestic nationalist sentiment, presented to the Iranian population as proof that external enemies are attacking the homeland. A sustained Kurdish insurgency operating inside Iran's own western provinces cannot be framed as foreign aggression without acknowledging that the regime has lost control of its own territory. And a regime that cannot control its own territory has lost the foundational claim that every authoritarian government depends on for its domestic political legitimacy. But let's back all the way up, because to understand why the warning sent from the mountains near Piranshahr on July 1st landed with the weight that it did, and why the next 90 days on Iran's western frontier may matter more for the long-term future of the Islamic Republic than anything happening in the Strait of Hormuz, you need to understand the full arc of how this moment arrived, what was promised, and then withdrawn, and why the fighters who were abandoned chose to keep fighting anyway. Every empire has a fault line it refuses to look at directly, the one crack in the foundation it hopes no one else notices, that it manages through force and silence rather than acknowledging and addressing. For the Islamic Republic of Iran, that fault line has always been Kurdistan, not the version that appears on clean official maps with neat administrative borders. The real lived reality of millions of ethnic Kurds spread across the mountains of western Iran, eastern Turkey, northern Iraq, and northeastern Syria, a nation without a state, armed with 4 centuries of accumulated grievance, and increasingly with weapons. For decades, Tehran managed this fault line through the formula that authoritarian governments have always defaulted to when facing populations they cannot politically integrate: overwhelming force, targeted assassination of leadership, and the sustained application of fear designed to make rebellion feel not just dangerous but futile. That formula worked right up until February 28, 2026, when Operation Epic Fury tore a hole through the myth of Iranian invincibility that the regime had spent 30 years carefully constructing. The killing of the supreme leader within the opening hours of that operation was not just a military event. It was a psychological rupture of the First Order. For 3 decades, Ali Khamenei's survival had functioned as the ultimate proof that the Islamic Republic could not be touched, that its security architecture was impenetrable, that its intelligence apparatus could detect and neutralize any threat before it reached the regime's core. When that proof was extinguished in the opening hours of a single military operation, the foundational psychological premise on which the regime's domestic control rested cracked in a way that no public statement, no state media narrative, and no display of retaliatory capability could fully repair. And the fighters who had spent generations waiting for exactly that crack to appear started moving. The 5 weeks that followed the opening strikes saw Iran absorb devastating sequential hits on its military infrastructure, its nuclear program, and its command structure simultaneously. And during that same period, Iran carried out hundreds of drone and missile strikes against exiled Iranian Kurdish militant groups based in Iraqi Kurdistan, an intensity of cross-border targeting that independent monitors documented carefully, killing at least 10 Kurdish fighters in relentless raids designed to prevent the kind of western frontier uprising that Tehran's strategic planners had always identified as one of the regime's most dangerous potential vulnerabilities. The fact that Iran was willing to spend that much of its already depleted drone and missile inventory targeting Kurdish positions in Iraq during a period when it was simultaneously absorbing American and Israeli strikes tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the regime takes the Kurdish insurgency threat. Because they knew what was coming, and they were trying to kill it before it could fully organize. Here's the part of the story that most coverage has not told with the detail it deserves, because it changes everything about how you understand the position the Kurdish fighters are currently in and the choices they have made. During the height of the war, reporting from the Washington Post and other outlets confirmed that the United States and Israel were actively encouraging Iranian Kurdish factions based in Iraq to launch a large-scale ground offensive across the border. President Trump personally offered what was described as extensive American air cover and other backing to anti-regime Kurdish groups, framing it explicitly as an opportunity to seize territory in western Iran. In private conversations with Kurdish leaders, the message from Washington was direct: choose a side, either with America and Israel or with Iran. One Kurdish opposition figure described the condition the fighters were operating under in terms that should be the anchor point for understanding everything that followed. The fighters could not move, he said, unless the sky above them was cleared first. They needed a no-fly zone, something comparable to the protection that American air power had extended to Iraqi Kurds after 1991, and that had created the conditions for Iraqi Kurdish autonomy to take root and survive. For a few extraordinary days in March 2026, it looked as if history might repeat that pattern. Kurdish fighters began moving into position near Maravan, thousands of them, coordinated, mobilized, ready, believing that American air power would clear the sky above them as promised, and that the window that Operation Epic Fury had opened in Iran's western frontier was finally going to be used. On March 7th and 8th, that belief was destroyed. President Trump reversed course publicly, stating he did not want Kurdish fighters entering the war, describing the conflict as complicated enough already, and saying he did not want to see Kurds get hurt or killed. Behind the scenes, Turkish President Erdogan had applied direct personal pressure on the administration, with Ankara's opposition to any Kurdish autonomous zone forming anywhere near its own Kurdish population, functioning as the decisive political weight that collapsed the plan. Israel's military intelligence directorate was reportedly skeptical of the offensive from the start. And so, without formal notification, without direct communication to the fighters who had already moved into position, without any negotiated withdrawal arrangement or acknowledgement of what had just been done, the plan died. The Kurdish fighters, who had mobilized near Maravan, learned about it through news reports. Not through any communication from their supposed American allies, through news reports. That is the specific texture of the betrayal that matters for understanding what has happened since. Read that carefully, because it is the psychological and historical context inside which every subsequent Kurdish decision has been made. This is not the first time this pattern has played out. In 1975, the United States abandoned Kurdish rebels in Iraq the moment a deal between Iran and Iraq rendered their usefulness to Washington obsolete. In 1991, Kurdish uprisings explicitly encouraged by Washington were left to be crushed by Saddam Hussein's forces after ceasefire lines were drawn, and the strategic calculus that had made Kurdish support valuable evaporated. And, in March 2026, fighters who had spent weeks mobilizing, who had moved into position along the mountain approaches near Maravan believing American air power had their backs, learned through news headlines that the air cover was not coming, and the offensive was over before it began. 3 times in 50 years, the same pattern. 3 generations of Kurdish fighters learning the same lesson about what American promises are worth at the moment they require American commitment to honor them. One Kurdish analyst described it with a precision that strips away every diplomatic euphemism. Washington was seeking a cost-free rebellion, one with no American ground deployment, no American casualties, no sustained American commitment. The Kurds were left to weigh seductive promises against a century of blood-soaked lessons about exactly how those promises tend to end. Now here is what nobody in Washington or Tehran anticipated. Instead of fading away after being abandoned, instead of standing down the fighters who had mobilized and accepting that the window had closed, the Kurdish opposition groups did something that genuinely surprised the analysts who had been modeling this situation. They kept fighting, on their own terms, without waiting for permission, without waiting for air cover, without waiting for any external actor to decide that their cause was strategically convenient enough to support this week. They decided that the fight itself had become worth continuing regardless of what any outside power chose to do or not do. And that is exactly what exploded into public view on July 1st, 2026. The Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan announced that 6 of its Peshmerga fighters had been killed in a direct clash with the IRGC near Piranshahr, inside Iranian Kurdistan. The Revolutionary Guard claimed it had eliminated 5 Kurdish militants in what it called a counter-terrorism operation. Strip away the competing narratives and one fact remains, which neither side disputes. This was a direct sustained firefight happening inside Iranian territory, months after the official ceasefire, in a region the regime has always insisted it fully controls. But that single engagement near Piranshahr is only the visible surface of something much larger building across Iran's entire western frontier simultaneously. That same week, the IRGC reported the deaths of 2 of its own members in what it called a terrorist act in the city of Paveh, an attack claimed by a newly formed Kurdish group called Zory Hewa, a name meaning son of hope that virtually no one outside the region had heard before 2026. Days later, the IRGC announced a separate counterterrorism operation in West Azerbaijan province along the Iraqi border, claiming to have destroyed a 6-member infiltration team. The Kurdistan Free Life Party, known as PJAK, confirmed that 4 of its own fighters were killed in clashes near Mahabad during the same operational window. 4 separate engagements, multiple provinces, the same handful of days, each one in a different geographic location across hundreds of kilometers of mountainous frontier terrain. The president of the American Kurdish Committee, Majid Golizadeh, said something in the immediate aftermath of these engagements that deserves to function as the analytical frame for everything else in this story. He said, "This is not business as usual. These are not periodic clashes on the border. What is happening now looks like coordinated operations reaching deep inside Iranian territory." That statement, from someone who has spent years tracking Kurdish-Iranian relations at close range, is not rhetorical emphasis. It is a precise operational characterization. The character of this conflict has changed. This is no longer Iran periodically bombing refugee camps in Iraq to keep a scattered opposition weak and disorganized. This is Kurdish fighters operating inside Iran's own claimed territory in coordinated waves across multiple provinces within the same operational window. That is a qualitative shift in the nature of the threat the IRGC is managing on its western frontier, and the IRGC's own response confirms that it understands the shift, even while its public communications continue framing every engagement as routine counterterrorism. Consider the geography of what Iran is now being forced to manage simultaneously. West Azerbaijan province, where the IRGC claims it destroyed a 6-member infiltration team. Kermanshah province, where the attack in Paveh killed 2 Revolutionary Guard members inside a city. The area around Mahabad, where PJAK fighters clashed with security forces in a sustained engagement. Piranshahr, where the deadliest confirmed firefight of this new wave took place. These are not neighboring towns. They are spread across hundreds of kilometers of mountainous terrain along almost the entire length of Iran's border with Iraq, forcing Tehran to stretch already depleted security forces across a front line nearly as long as the southern coastline. It is simultaneously defending against American naval and air power. A regime managing a 2-front military problem simultaneously, one against the most powerful military alliance in the modern world along its coast, and one against a domestic insurgency it thought it had permanently contained along its western mountains, is a regime whose resources, attention, and institutional bandwidth are all being consumed in directions they were never simultaneously demanded before this year. The IRGC was built to be formidable on one major axis at a time. It is being stretched across multiple axes simultaneously, and the Western Mountain Front is the one that the mainstream coverage is least equipped to explain and least focused on tracking. Now let's talk about the numbers, because the raw troop count picture is the most commonly cited reason why analysts dismiss the Kurdish insurgency as a strategic threat to the regime's survival, and why that dismissal misses the actual mechanism through which insurgencies threaten regimes. Kurdish opposition groups based in Iraqi Kurdistan are estimated to number approximately 1,000 lightly armed fighters. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps fields hundreds of thousands of personnel nationwide, supplemented by the Basij paramilitary network that extends the regime's coercive capacity down to the neighborhood level in Iranian cities. On pure numerical comparison, this looks like an asymmetric contest so lopsided that it cannot possibly threaten the regime's survival in any direct military sense. But raw troop counts have never been the mechanism through which successful insurgencies threaten state survival. The mechanism is resource depletion, attention fragmentation, political legitimacy erosion, and the compounding psychological effect of a regime being forced to acknowledge that it cannot suppress armed resistance in territory it publicly claims to control. Every successful counterinsurgency in history required the government side to commit overwhelming resources, sustained institutional attention, and coherent strategic direction to a single theater over an extended time frame. The IRGC cannot commit overwhelming resources, sustained attention, and coherent strategic direction to its western mountain front, while simultaneously managing the Strait of Hormuz, absorbing American airstrikes, navigating a contested succession following the Supreme Leader's death, defending against missile launches being intercepted over Kuwait and Bahrain, and attempting to hold together a nuclear negotiating framework whose terms it has already violated. The insurgency does not need to defeat the IRGC conventionally to be strategically significant. It needs to keep the IRGC stretched, depleted, and distracted across multiple simultaneous axes, while the other pressure tracks operating against the regime compound in their individual effects. An IRGC battalion committed to counterinsurgency operations in West Azerbaijan province is not available to reinforce a position that American airstrikes have just degraded in the south. An IRGC intelligence unit focused on tracking Kurdish infiltration routes through the Zagros Mountains is not focused on monitoring urban resistance networks in Tehran. Strategic bandwidth is finite, and the Kurdish insurgency is consuming a portion of it that the IRGC cannot afford to spend right now. There's also the weapons dimension that independent analysts have noted, specifically reporting from Turkish government-linked media claiming that Israel's Mossad has been quietly arming Kurdish fighters with weapons originally seized from Hamas and Hezbollah. The coalition of political forces of Iranian Kurdistan has publicly denied this claim. Tehran clearly believes it, given how aggressively the regime has escalated both its rhetoric and its cross-border strike operations against Kurdish factions since these reports first emerged. Whether or not the specific claim about Mossad-sourced weapons is accurate, the IRGC is operating on the assumption that the Kurdish coalition has external material support it did not previously have, and it is calibrating its response to that assumption. An adversary that operates on the belief that you are better armed than you actually are is an adversary whose tactical calculus has been altered by the information environment alone. Then there is the assassination campaign, and specifically the killing that should have generated far more international attention than it received. On July 2, 2026, Saran Mamadzadeh, a member of the Kurdistan Freedom Party known as PJAK, was assassinated in Erbil, the capital of Iraq's semi-autonomous Kurdistan region. Erbil is not a remote border village. It is a functioning city with its own security apparatus, its own governance structure, its own international presence. The Kurdistan regional government has spent years building Erbil into something resembling a normal modern city, precisely to demonstrate that Kurdish self-governance can produce stability and economic development rather than chaos. Killing a Kurdish opposition figure there sends a message that Iran's operational reach extends into the heart of Iraqi Kurdish territory, into the very space that these fighters and their leadership depend on as a relatively secure staging area and organizational base. The message is the same one the regime has sent with the same playbook against Iranian nuclear scientists, against dissidents in European cities, against journalists in capitals where their physical presence was supposed to offer some measure of protection from Tehran's reach. No location is safe. No international boundary provides cover. The regime's capacity for targeted killing extends wherever its enemies seek refuge. But here is what the assassination in Erbil reveals about the regime's actual strategic posture that the public framing of Iranian strength obscures. When a government begins simultaneously assassinating opposition figures on foreign soil, issuing Interpol red notices to use international law enforcement systems as instruments of political repression against exiled leaders, pressuring Iraq and the Kurdistan regional government to disarm Kurdish parties under bilateral security agreements, and conducting hundreds of cross-border strikes on positions in Iraqi territory, all while its own soldiers are dying in coordinated ambushes inside its own claimed provinces. That is not the behavior of a regime in secure control of its situation. That is the behavior of a regime that is scared of what it sees building along its western frontier and is deploying every available tool simultaneously to prevent it from reaching the scale it fears. The escalating diplomatic pressure on Baghdad and the KRG reveals the same underlying anxiety. Iran is pushing the Iraqi government to enforce the March 2023 security agreement that calls for disarming Iranian Kurdish parties positioned along the border. This pressure campaign puts the Kurdish regional government in what analysts have accurately described as an almost impossible position. The KRG's president, Netravan Barzani, has been threading an extraordinarily careful diplomatic needle, publicly stating that the Kurdistan region must not become part of any conflict or military escalation that harms the lives and security of its own citizens, while emphasizing that protecting Kurdish autonomy in Iraq depends on unity among all Kurdish political forces. Translate that from diplomatic language into operational reality. Barzani is trying to avoid provoking Tehran into resuming strikes on Iraqi Kurdish territory while simultaneously avoiding the appearance of betraying Kurdish fighters across the border who are dying in provinces that share cultural and ethnic identity with his own constituency. This is a genuine political impossibility. And the fact that senior Iraqi Kurdish leaders, including Masoud Barzani and Bafel Talabani, were present at the funeral of Iran's late supreme leader, paying respects to the regime whose forces are actively killing Kurdish fighters a few hundred kilometers from where they stood, captures the transactional complexity of these relationships with an image that requires no editorial analysis. Turkey remains the external actor whose position most constrains the strategic options available to Kurdish forces and their potential supporters. Ankara's intervention in March 2026 to kill the planned Kurdish offensive was not a one-time policy preference expression. It was the most recent application of a consistent, decades-long Turkish strategic doctrine that treats any Kurdish autonomous zone anywhere in the region as an existential threat to Turkish territorial integrity. Every time Kurdish forces gain ground or international attention, Turkish officials calculate whether success in one country could inspire renewed momentum for Kurdish political ambitions within their own borders. That calculation has consistently produced the same answer, and it has consistently produced Turkish diplomatic pressure to prevent Kurdish strategic gains wherever they appear to be within reach. The American position is the most consequential external variable in the Kurdish strategic picture, and it is the one most characterized by the specific kind of institutional inconsistency that Kurdish political history has taught Kurdish leaders to treat as a structural feature rather than an anomaly. The United States remains formally committed to a memorandum of understanding with Iran, whose language critics within the Kurdish community have read as effectively signaling that Washington will not interfere in Iran's internal affairs going forward. Golizada invoked Ronald Reagan's approach to the Soviet Union as the model Washington has failed to live up to, arguing that even while negotiating with hostile powers, American support for freedom movements should not be publicly abandoned in diplomatic language that the movements themselves can read and interpret. That single sentence in the memorandum, whatever the intent behind its drafting, has been read by virtually every Iranian opposition group as confirmation of the abandonment pattern their history has given them every reason to anticipate. And the Kurdish community's response to that reading has not been to stand down. It has been to decide that waiting for American commitment is not a viable strategic posture, and that the fight has to proceed on the terms that are actually available rather than the terms that were briefly promised and then withdrawn. Senior analyst Mohammed Saleh at the Foreign Policy Research Institute has been direct about the conditions that would be required for Kurdish action to meaningfully threaten the regime's survival: a fresh U.S.-Israel-Iran conflict and credible guarantees of sustained air protection. Conditions he assessed as showing little sign of materializing in their full form. Henry Barkey, whose scholarship on Kurdish politics spans decades, was equally direct in his assessment that any renewed effort to take on the Iranian government with Kurdish support was not serious at this stage, requiring a massive mobilization of resources, planning, and long-term strategic thinking that the current geopolitical environment has not produced. This is the uncomfortable middle ground where the Kurdish insurgency currently sits, significant enough in its operational scope and its political implications to change the IRGC's resource allocation and institutional attention in ways that compound every other pressure the regime is simultaneously absorbing, not strong enough on its own, without sustained external air cover and material support, to directly threaten the regime's survival in the immediate term. Too real to dismiss as border noise, too unsupported to fulfill the maximum strategic potential that its organizational maturity and geographic positioning would theoretically allow. What has changed is not Kurdish military capability measured in raw numbers. What has changed is the perception of Iranian weakness and the cascading effects that perception produces on every calculation being made by every actor watching this situation. A regime that just lost its supreme leader to a foreign airstrike, that is rebuilding bombed nuclear facilities while under active American surveillance, that is absorbing systematic degradation of its maritime infrastructure along its southern coast, and that is simultaneously fighting Kurdish ambushes inside its own western provinces, that it is being forced to acknowledge, rather than suppress silently, no longer projects the aura of invincibility that once made rebellion feel not just dangerous but genuinely futile. And once that psychological wall cracks, as every case study in the history of authoritarian regime instability confirms, it rarely rebuilds itself quietly. The wall does not have to fall all at once. The crack just has to widen faster than the regime can fill it. Consider what Iranian state media's current coverage of the Kurdish front actually reveals about how much control the regime has lost over the narrative on its own western frontier. A year ago, a Kurdish attack inside Iranian territory would have been quietly suppressed from the public record, handled through security force operations that were never publicly acknowledged, erased from the information environment that the regime controlled through its monopoly on domestic media. Today, every clash is documented, photographed, and broadcast within hours by Kurdish media organizations and international outlets. The IRGC is in a defensive posture it has never previously had to maintain along this frontier, constantly issuing public statements explaining away losses it once could have simply made invisible. That shift from silence to forced acknowledgement is itself a measurable indicator of how much control the regime has lost, even before you account for the fighters, the weapons, or the terrain. The recruitment picture is the most revealing indicator of the insurgency's actual trajectory. Kurdish political figures have described a surge in recruitment following the failed offensive of March, the abandoned air cover, the continued ambushes that the regime has been unable to stop, and the assassination of Saran Mahmadzadeh in Erbil. What one Kurdish figure described as a wave of proud, committed younger fighters filling the ranks of parties and camps across the border in Iraqi Kurdistan is not the organizational signature of a defeated movement absorbing a strategic reversal and drawing down. It is the organizational signature of a movement whose cause has been energized rather than extinguished by the circumstances of the last several months. Young Kurdish fighters who watched the promised air cover disappear, who watched their comrades die in Piranshahr and Mahabad without external protection, who watched a Kurdish figure get assassinated in Erbil in what was supposed to be relatively safe territory, are joining in greater numbers than before any of that happened. This is the dynamic that the analytical frameworks built around raw troop counts consistently fail to capture. The question for an insurgency is not how many fighters it has today. It is whether the conditions producing fighters are accelerating or decelerating. When recruitment surges after a military setback, the setback has produced a political effect that exceeds its military cost. The Islamic Republic has been trying to destroy the Kurdish insurgency through force for 50 years. Every application of force has produced more fighters than it has eliminated, because the conditions generating Kurdish fighters, the grievances, the cultural suppression, the political exclusion, the memory of Khomeini's 1979 jihad against Iranian Kurds, are structural features of the relationship between the Kurdish population and the Islamic Republic that military operations cannot resolve. They can only suppress their surface manifestation temporarily while the underlying pressures continue accumulating. Now let's look at the three threads that will tell you more about the real trajectory of this conflict over the coming weeks than any diplomatic statement from Doha or any satellite photograph from the Iranian south. The first thread is whether Baghdad and the Kurdistan regional government actually move forward with disarming Iranian Kurdish factions under Tehran's pressure. If the KRG enforces the 2023 security agreement and removes the organizational and logistical base from which the Kurdish coalition has been operating in Iraqi Kurdistan, the insurgency loses its rear area security and its cross-border staging capacity. This would be a significant strategic blow to the Kurdish coalition's operational continuity. But it would also trigger a political rupture inside Iraqi Kurdish society between the established KRG leadership and the broader Kurdish population that identifies with the fighters across the border. A rupture that Iraqi Kurdish leaders have been desperately trying to avoid because it would undermine the internal unity on which their own political authority rests. The second thread is whether Iran expands its assassination campaign from Erbil into other cities, where Iranian Kurdish opposition leaders have sought refuge. A single high-profile assassination in one city establishes proof of concept. Multiple assassinations in multiple cities within a short time frame establishes a pattern that fundamentally changes the security calculus for every Iranian Kurdish political figure living outside Iran. It also risks producing international blowback of the kind that the regime's current strategic position makes difficult to absorb, and it risks galvanizing the Kurdish diaspora and international Kurdish support networks in ways that could accelerate the material support flowing to the fighters in the mountains. The third thread is whether recruitment among Iranian Kurdish youth continues accelerating even as the death toll climbs. If the recruitment surge reverses, if the demonstrated lethality of IRGC operations against Kurdish fighters, combined with the continued absence of external air cover, produces a deterrence effect that breaks the momentum of organizational expansion. The insurgency may stabilize at a level that the regime can manage as a chronic irritant without it developing into an acute strategic threat. If the recruitment surge continues and deepens, the insurgency's organizational capacity will continue expanding even as its current fighters absorb losses, and the mathematical relationship between the fighters the regime is eliminating and the fighters joining to replace them will determine the long-term trajectory of the western frontier. What the Kurdish fighters who sent this warning from the mountains near Piranshahr have proven definitively is that abandoned promises and withdrawn air cover were not sufficient to make the resistance disappear. They proved it without American jets, without Israeli material support that has been publicly confirmed, without the formal organizational backing that the Grand March offensive would have provided. They proved it through the decision of fighters with real grievances and real organizational maturity to keep fighting a war their fathers and grandfathers started long before this year's headlines existed, on the grounds that the fight itself has become worth continuing, regardless of what any external actor decides about its strategic convenience. Iran has survived Kurdish uprisings before. The historical record is clear on this. It will almost certainly survive this current wave of clashes without losing formal control of its western provinces in the immediate future. But survival is not the same thing as stability, and stability is the thing the Islamic Republic needs most right now as it attempts to navigate nuclear negotiations, economic collapse, succession politics, southern coastal bombardment, and the accumulated political consequences of 50 years of governance by revolutionary violence. Every ambush near Piranshahr widens the crack. Every assassination in Erbil reveals the reach of a regime that is simultaneously being struck from outside and bled from within. Every Interpol red notice issued against an exiled opposition leader tells you that Tehran is trying to use international legal systems to do the suppression work that its military forces cannot do cleanly and quietly in the mountains anymore. And every surge in Kurdish recruitment tells you that the fighters on those mountain roads near Piranshahr have decided something that no promise from Washington and no threat from Tehran has been able to reverse. The war everyone is watching is in the Gulf. The war that could actually determine what Iran looks like, not in the next 90 days, but in the next 5 years, may be happening in a mountain pass near a town most people outside the region have never heard of. In the pre-dawn darkness, in terrain the IRGC claims to control and is fighting to hold, against fighters who were promised the sky would be cleared for them and found that it was not, and decided to keep moving forward anyway. The fault line has always been there. It is no longer silent. And whatever gets agreed in the negotiating rooms of Doha or Geneva, whatever new memorandum of understanding gets signed between Washington and Tehran, the mountain war along Iran's western border is not going to wait for anyone's permission to continue. The fighters in those mountains have already demonstrated that they do not need it.